I like good quotations. Here's some of my favorite quotations that are relevant to poetymology and the evolution of language. First, my favorite comes from Emerson, an essayist, a writer from 200 years ago, American. Ralph Waldo Emerson, from an essay called The Poet. The etymologist finds the deadest word to have been once a brilliant picture. Language is fossil poetry. As the limestone of the continent consists of infinite masses of the shells of animalcules, so language is made up of images or tropes, which now, in their secondary use, have long ceased to remind us of their poetic origin. Ralph Waldo Emerson. That's why I think of every little poem as every word is a little poem to be explicated. You look in every word and you can usually find some poetic tricks in there that show you the history, its etymology, basically, that helps shape the word, onomatopoeia, verbal gesture, visemes, things like that. Now, another writer who I've learned a lot from is a British guy, Robin Aylott. I recommend this book, The Physical Foundation of Language. Robin Aylott. British. I think he might be gone now, but fairly recent. Here's just a couple kind of random. He surveys the literature, all the biologists from previous centuries or millennia even. He's got a classical European education. He speaks a lot of languages. But he surveys the literature of anthropology, philosophy, surveys the literature of language evolution. And so you can learn a lot that way. And then he has a whole theory himself of how language evolves. But it's very much about evolutionary, how language evolved. Almost, like our bodies do. Not in an abstract, assigned meaning way, but in organic evolution. Okay, here's a couple examples of his thought, anyway, of how he thinks about language. The learning of words by a child is a natural process which is seeded by the form of the elementary words that it first hears. The child is naturally programmed to develop a consistent language of some kind, but the environment determines which language this should be. The child is essentially given clues as to the kind of language it should develop, and the language is not simply learnt, but unfolds in the child. This is why we all don't speak one language. Like, we all pretty much walk the same, but we talk a little differently, though there are foundational commonalities amongst languages because we all have similar brains and bodies. But the idea that each language is its own, can be seeded, that each language can be planted in a child's brain just with a few words and a few sentences coming from those around it. The child can then intuit the logic of the language, the way it works, and start to figure its way in to the language. It doesn't have a dictionary. It doesn't have a teacher telling it how to think and what to think. The parents do that to some degree, but they can't yet talk to the child. The child can't talk like an adult can. They can't be educated and learned. There is something about the language that is intuitive, that the child can deduce its patterns, its syntax, grammar, but also the meanings of its words. These have evolved into the language by trial and error, like evolution works. Each generation can only recreate, can only take in what it can remember and what it can understand. And so words are shaped by that. They have to pass through this sieve to the next generation. Words that are too complicated or assigned conventional meanings might not work. They have to conform to the intuition of the next generation. And they have to be deducible, intuitable. Now, this is in opposition to the way linguistics has been theorizing for the last century or two, ever since Darwin, basically. Linguists have resisted this idea of evolution in language. It kind of stuck to the idea to some degree that language was abstract and that it was a human invention, that we create language consciously, that it's not quite part of our body, that it's assigned meanings, conventionally assigned meanings, that it's all culture, no nature, was a kind of a trap we fell into. Partly it's because language, especially before writing, didn't really leave fossils, and so we couldn't really see, like we could with bones and fossils, we could kind of see a long history of evolution. Language is it's sound doesn't fossilize, so we're limited in this way. And the evolutionary discussion of language was therefore kind of problematic. This kind of thinking, the assigned meaning of language, its chief proponent was a guy named de Saussure, a Swiss anthropologist from 100 years ago or so. Here's what de Saussure wrote. He was the one that came up with the idea of signifier, meaning the word, and signified, meaning the meaning. And he said that there was no connection between the two, that it's arbitrary, that when we assign meaning, it's arbitrary. It doesn't matter what the form of the word is, as long as we all agree on it. Here's some quotations from him, a speech of his from last century. No one has proved that speech, as it manifests itself when we speak, is entirely natural, i.e., that our vocal apparatus is designed for speaking just as our legs were designed for walking. Language is a convention, and the nature of the sign agreed upon does not matter. More. Language exists in the form of a sum of impressions deposited in the brain of each member of a community, almost like a dictionary of which identical copies have been distributed to each individual. The bond between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. I can simply say the linguistic sign is arbitrary, unmotivated, and that it actually has no natural connection with the signified. I think this is one reason we haven't been looking at, in a very close way, how poetymology, or how words actually evolved, because it was easier just to assume that all that was just a conscious creation, that we all just invent language, or else that we were born in it, that we had a dictionary implanted in our brain. None of this works for evolutionary biology. Forms have to be heritable. Basically, the problem is that the children have to be able to learn the form. And only the forms that children can learn can be passed on. But children are learning the language from the outside. When they're born, they don't have the language embedded in their brain. Like learning to walk, we naturally do. It's part of our bodily process. We are primed to, and we're not very conscious of how we walk. We trial and error. We do it until we get it right. But which muscles we're using, it's evolutionary. We have to kind of evolve and grow as we grow. It's an intuitive process. This is actually how language works too. The children are born with the ability, the intuitive abilities to figure out language. We are born looking at the faces of others, especially our mother. We're watching them speak. We're reading the body language as they speak, the visemes, the verbal gestures. We're connecting these movements to sounds, and we have the ability to mirror these movements, so we can imitate and recreate the sounds, and all of that gives us a way into the meaning of what others are saying, basically. But it's an imitative process. Language, and so the words and the forms have to evolve to be imitatable, understandable to the next generation. So it can't be arbitrary. You just can't take any word, because there's no guaranteeing that will be transmittable, memorable to the next generation. It's a fine process of what works in that regard. Words come and go depending on whether or not they can be passed on to the next generation. So that's De Saussure there. He was basically a counterpoint. His thought, which was quite dominant in the last century, I think led us away from what I call the poetic evolution of words, from looking at the actual form of words. Why are words shaped that they are? It's not just assigned and arbitrary. That was quite misleading. So poetymology is the reason I use the word, or think it's an important word, is because it takes us back to evolution, the idea of evolution, that every form, there's a why there, that every form has a reason, that there's all biological forms, and language is part of our biology, that anything that lasts has a reason. And that's what I mean, or what Emerson means when he says fossil poetry. All the forms have you're seeing the history of the word when you look at the poetry of the word. These are it's the way that the word got into the language. The iconism appeals, or is readable to the next generation, but it's not a self-conscious construction. It's unconscious evolution. We don't even understand our own poetymology as we speak. It's speaking like walking is evolved, complex, and mostly unconscious. I've read quite a few scientists speculating on the origin of language. Talk about gestures, that language may have come from bodily gesture, body language. When we talk today, we still move our hands a lot, gesturing. Here's Sir Richard Paget, P-A-G-E-T. It may be Paget, I don't know. 1930, he wrote a book on human speech. He was an anthropologist. He says, human speech arose out of a generalized, unconscious, pantomimic gesture language made by the limbs and features as a whole. In recognizing speech sound, the human ear is listening to indications due to resonance of the position and gestures of the organs of articulation. More, the basis of symbolism is the ability of the articulatory apparatus, and particularly the tongue, to imitate motion and contour in the external world. The muscles of articulation perform in miniature what originally were gross gestures of the hand or body generally. The addition of phonation to the movements produced meaningful utterances in which the muscle action represented the meaning. So we're mimics. First we were mimicking with our hands. Then we translated those movements, the motor neuron programs in our brain of those movements. We could also, we found, do it with our tongue, basically, like grab, grab, clamp. Then we could project it with our voice while we were saying it, and that made because we have something called mirror neurons, apparently, our ability to see someone else's face, and when that person is speaking, it activates our brain can also, in a sort of a virtual way, perform the similar actions and then repeat them. Babies have this. That's how they learn to speak. They see their parents speaking. So a lot of it's based on lip reading, our body language as a whole. And even though it's not all body language, it's facial language and expression. And we can see a lot of our language on our lips. Our lip read can tell what's being said. And so it's still body language to a large degree. Mirror neurons. Here's another scientist, V.S. Ramachandran, Indian, I think maybe Indian American. He wrote about mirror neurons. Here's what he says. I believe that these neurons may have played an important role in human evolution. One of the hallmarks of our species is what we call culture. Culture depends crucially on imitations of parents and teachers, and the imitation of complex skills may require the participation of mirror neurons. I think that somewhere around 50,000 years ago, maybe the mirror neurons system became sufficiently sophisticated that there was an explosive evolution of this ability to mime complex actions, in turn leading to cultural transmission of information, which is what characterizes us humans. Basically, we got more sophisticated at imitation, is what he says, and that enabled language and the imitation of body language to pass it on. And then basically that gestural language turned into a verbal gesture, the ability to inflect sound, and then for us to intuit what people's articulatory organs were doing it. And basically language evolved out of that capacity. Here's another scientist. One more thing, Ramachandran is interesting as well, because he not only talks about mirror neurons here, but he did another trick. This is just an aside, but he did a trick. He helped solve the problem of ghost limbs by, ghost pain. Ghost pain is when, say, if you're missing a leg, it got amputated, yet you still feel a ghost pain in that leg. Ramachandran invented a mirror box that you would put your legs in, or your one leg in, but then he put a mirror in the box there as an illusion, so that when you looked down at your missing leg, you would see the reflection of the opposite leg there, and so you would have the illusion that both legs were there. And this actually helped these people. It cured the ghost pains. Just that trick of seeing both legs tricked the brain into cutting off the pain. It solved the problem, the illusion, or it seemed to solve the problem to the brain, so it didn't hurt anymore. That just shows the capacity of the brain, the plasticity of the ability to absorb information and act on it unconsciously. Because consciously we know that the leg is still amputated. But Edelman, the next scientist talk about is Gerald Edelman. Edelman, he actually won a Nobel Prize for his work on the immune system. He's in the 70s, I think. He's a brain scientist. He came during the time when scientists could first start looking at the brain, with scanning, advanced scanning. They could watch the brain, look at the brain in action, MRI kind of things, and other types of scanning, modern scanning. And so there's been an explosion in brain science in recent years. But here's a quote from Edelman. In the biological view, symbols do not get assigned meanings by formal means. Instead, it is assumed that symbol structures are meaningful to begin with. This is so because categories are determined by bodily structure and by adaptive use as a result of evolution and behavior. The symbols of cognition must match the conceptual apparatus contained in real brains. The bases for truth and knowledge come from this apparatus and have their earliest foundations in evolutionarily derived value systems. Just language is part of our nature. consciousness is a bit overrated in language creation. The forms evolved biologically out of our environment, almost like bird calls do, and other the language of other animals. Ours is more complex. That's something we evolved, but it's still natural and organic in its basic form. Our brains have evolved to it. He says Edelman comes up with something called neural Darwinism to explain how language has evolved so rapidly in our brain, and it's evolution in a faster way, basically, because it happens in our brain. And that he says that basically brain structures, I wrote about it in a book I wrote. I wrote a book about all this called Poetymology, basically how words evolve. So I'm going to quote myself here, writing about Edelman. Neural Darwinism theorizes that brain neuron structures are, like all biological forms, in a competition to survive. Word choices in our language are a contest among suites of potential words competing to either get used or get lost. With each use, a word's neural support is enhanced and more likely to be called on next time. Words that don't get used become increasingly weaker over time and less likely to be used until their neural support is gone and they cannot be remembered. Poetymology has evolved to make words more apt and memorable, which is how words survive in our language. So it's sort of like there's a jungle in the brain, and the words are all in the linguistic brain, let's say, and the words are competing to survive. And those that get used, their neurons, their motor neuron program that's required to speak that word. Speaking is complex. It takes a lot of muscles to speak a word. But that program, that little program for that word, each time you use it, it's a little more robust, fires more easily. When a situation for that word comes up, it rises to the top of the list, almost like Google search prompts do. That word will be higher up in this case. Whereas the words that are infrequently used, they lose the contest. They get pushed down the list, and eventually, because they don't get used, you forget them. You can't remember everything. The brain weeds out things it doesn't think it needs, or just entropy. They dissipate over time. So, another thing from Ramachandran along this regard, his idea, he says, he explains the basis, like our tongues have the ability to imitate, or our hands have the ability to imitate forms and movement. And that's a basis for basically iconic language. But here's how Ramachandran explains. It's a certain kind of synesthesia, how we can see movement and translate it into sound or gesture. Or, kinesthesia. Basically, we're tying different media together to create a symbolic language with our voice and our gestures. But Ramachandran talks about a really fundamental anthropological experiment called the Bubba Kiki experiment. It's in this experiment, people are shown two shapes that are different. One's a jagged shape and one's a rounded shape. That's it right there. Booba Kiki. And then people are asked which name goes to which shape. Which shape is called Booba and which is called Kiki. And 98% of the time, the rounded shape is called Booba. They've done this in all cultures and found it to be true. And the Kiki, which is a Kiki, kind of a harsher word, more pointed word, Kiki, is the jagged shape. And he calls that sort of the basis for what I call poetymology, basically. So it's like the word spoon sounds smooth, fork sticks. This is the way we hear and we differentiate different words and assign them meaning because of that. They parallel differences out in reality. And that's how we can, that's a basis for symbolic language, why iconic words work to convey meaning. So the Bubakiki experiment. Okay, let's take another quote. Ramachandran. Now, another scientist, I read a book by a brain scientist on the evolutionary language. His name's Stanislas Dehaene, and he has a theory. He wrote a book about reading in the brain, but he was speculating how it evolved in our brain, how something like the ability to read evolved in our brain. Here's what he says. Drop the spoon. Years of experience with hunter-gatherers in the Amazon, New Guinea, or the African bush led anthropologists to marvel at the Aborigines' ability to read the natural word. They decipher animal tracks with amazing ease. Meticulous inspection of broken branches or faint tracks in the dirt allows them to quickly figure out what animal has been around, its size, the direction in which it went, and a number of other details that will be invaluable for hunting. We, moderns, are essentially illiterate about all these natural signs. It is possible that reading animal tracks is the cortical precursor for reading. If evolution has yielded bodily specializations as refined as the eagle's eye or the leopard's leap, it no doubt can modify the predator's visual brain. The intense selective pressure imposed by millions of years of interaction between predator and prey may have led to a cortical specialization for reading animal tracks. Interesting theory. Okay. Here's a couple less scientific quotations that are some come from more philosophy and poetry. Mostly quotations that I find interesting. Here's Robert Frost from his notebooks. A sentence carries a certain number of words, and those have their sound. But the sentence has a sound of its own apart from the words, which is the sentence proper. It was before words were. It still has existence without the embodiment of words in the cries of our nature. That's a poetic, a real contrast to the De Saussurian idea that the word and the word's form and its meaning are only arbitrarily connected. I think Robert Frost here is saying that words come out of our original organic expressions that we as animals make, emotional expressions of pain, curiosity, laughter, joy, whatever emotion we feel often has an accompanying sound to it. I think about the word ma, mother, ma, because it's, I think, as far as I know, pretty much universal. I think about that word, and I was like, ah. It's two very organic sounds of satisfaction. Ma. And mother, at the beginning, is the source of our food and our comfort and everything. So I can see that word in a Robert Frost sense. It's cries of our nature help promulgate that word across culture. Okay, let's another one. Well, Nietzsche, there is more wisdom in your body than your deepest philosophy. I think that's a recognition that consciousness is fairly shallow. It's working in a virtual reality, not in reality, whereas our bodies are in reality. They are real material, evolved, complex structures that our language is working in, a virtual reality. It represents, it mirrors reality, but it doesn't have, nearly as many dimensions. So the map can never be as sophisticated as what's being mapped as reality. Here's one, Buckminster Fuller, engineer, scientist, oddball. No human being has ever seen or sensed outside of self. All our sensing is nerve relayed inward to be directly sensed only in our brain. We have become so accustomed to the reliability of the information relaying inward to our brain that we now misassume that we are seeing things directly outside ourselves. I'm trying to think how relevant that is to poetymology. It's just, I think, a realizing that we are in a subjective universe, that, our senses, our vision's so good we think we're actually seeing reality, when really we're seeing our own, brain's representation of vision. And we forget sometimes that we don't really see reality directly. Same idea about this. It can be deceptive. We think we are creating reality sometimes. We think that it's a we kind of fall in love with our own creations and mistake it for reality. I think that's what a mistake de Saussure was making, thinking that we made up language. And really, language is part of our nature, and we utilize our nature, but we don't necessarily even understand it. And so language isn't a conscious construction. It's still part of the mystery of our biology out of a billion-year-old past. Thomas Mann, from an essay or from his book Dr. Faustus. For in the end, naivete lies at the bottom of all being, even the most conscious and complicated. Yeah, we're all naive. That's why science calls all its ideas theories, hypotheses. It realizes in the long run there will be a bigger picture, that we'll know a little more reality, and it'll overturn most of our ideas because we're naive. Poetymology seems kind of naive, that every word's a little poem. I think that's why we discount it. We don't see that the onomatopoeia and verbal gesture and the like actually is how language was built. Seems too simplistic, childish almost. But it is very childish, because the determinant for evolution isn't how sophisticated the individual can become, but it's what passes from that individual to the next generation. So it has to go from the most sophisticated individual to the beginning child. It has to go through that network, or through that sieve. Here's a complicated one. It is romantic when one sees in art, not nature, let us say, but the reverse. That's Thomas Mann. It's got the double negative that the Germans did. Okay, it is romantic when one sees in art, not nature, let us say, but the reverse. This isn't like painting a picture of nature. What he's saying here is that's not so romantic, to create an image, an abstract image, basically, of nature. What's romantic is when you realize that nature is an artistic creation, that it's the same process that as art, and trial and error, that it is like poetymology is the poetry. The poetry of our language is naturally evolved. We didn't invent it. It invented our language. It's a naturally evolved artistic construction, our language. And, so is, our life forms. That art is an imitation of nature, really. Not a representation, but an imitation of nature. It's not abstract, that, natural, it's evolved, naturally evolved. So, that's Thomas Mann also. He was a writer from last century, a German writer. So that's most of my quotes, or many quotes that I thought one way or another I've come across during my study of poetymology, and I hope they're useful, or at least interesting.